Good morning to all of you. First of all, my most dearest thanks to the organizers of this marvelous conference, to Eero Tarasti, of course, and to Joan Grimalt, also to the ESMUC offering us these spaces in order to present our conferences. For me, it's a big pleasure and a big honor to share with you my humble thoughts on certain things, as you will see. Actually, the subject of my presentation is a bit different from, I would say, many of the other presentations, as I will not deal with the meanings of music in music, but with the meanings of music in literature. So it's a little bit of a different perspective. And for this reason, I've chosen one of the classics of Spanish literature, which is the book of Good Love by the Archpriest of Ita. Okay, this is a very famous source, actually, as we will see later on, because it contains a vast, very long list of musical terms and musical instruments, especially, and this for a period where we do not have too many sources, which is the 14th century. So, of course, this different perspective of mine leads to some other differences also in scope and in methods. And as I am a musicologist, I'm accustomed to reading studies of this kind of literature to try to answer mainly the question, which were the musical instruments at this time in the Middle Ages, and how did they sound, and which organological characteristics did they have. And of course, this is something usually a philologist or a literary researcher will not ask himself. So he has other intentions, other objectives. And I will try to show a little bit that what we can learn from literary studies actually as musicologists can be very, very fruitful and revealing for the music of, in this case, the Middle Ages. So let's talk a little bit about the author. His name is Juan Ruiz, the Archpriest of Ita. So he was born in Aguilar de Henares in circa 1283 and died in 1350, approximately, because we actually do not have too much information about his life. There are even people who question his existence altogether and argue that Juan Ruiz is nothing more than what would be John Smith in English, so just a generic name. The book that we have of this author is called The Book of Good Love, and Libro de Buen Amor. And as I told you, it's a classic in Spanish literary history. It was written supposedly between 1330 and 1343. And it's a very heterogeneous poem consisting of as many as 1,728 stanzas. And there is a part in it which, by some experts, is interpreted as autobiographical, though others question it and speak of a fictitious biography, which are questions that will not concern us here, so we can skip this. It belongs to a genre called the Musical Signification, which basically means that we have here a literary production which lies in the hand of clergyman. Okay. The subject of the book is, as tells the title, by the way, the title is not his, but the title has been given by Spanish philology lots of centuries later. But the subject of the book is love, and especially the distinction between good love, buen amor, and foolish love, loco amor. This is important to take into consideration, especially this dealing with oppositions, with binary oppositions, with good love and foolish love. In terms of literary forms, we have also very heterogeneous material here. We have fables, allegories, moralities, etc. Lots of different forms. And even we have some very deeply religious parts. We have songs to the Virgin, for example. But we also have satires, and very explicit satires at that. So it's really heterogeneous from all points of view. The sources, and we're talking about if he exists, of an author with a very deep knowledge for the time. In classical literature, so for example, Ovid is one of his sources, and he's also aware of French tradition at the same time. So, for example, and even the Arab tradition has been demonstrated. It's very important in this work. We are talking about Ibn Hazm, for example, with his Arab Spanish or Spanish Arab classic, The Reign of the Dove. So most of the researchers claim that he spoke and read Arab fluently, which also has its meaning because, as we will see, Arab and Islam will appear in what's in the passages we will be dealing with. So the author's intention is still quite much discussed in Spanish literature. So some say it is a work with a didactic intention, with a moral intention. Others say it's just plainly cynical. So these, as happens in many cases in Spanish sciences as well in musicology, sometimes these just depend on where the writing author and researcher is situated. If it's more or less close to the church, for example, it would lead, then you come to other conclusions than if he perhaps maintains a greater distance to the church. In musicological literature specifically, this work is extremely famous, as I told you, because it contains a long list of musical instruments. I seem to remember that someone wrote it's the largest list of musical instruments that we have in all the Middle Ages, not only in Spain. I'm not sure if this is true because there's some showing off always in these kind of comparisons. So in any case, if it's not the largest list, it is quite a long list. And within this list, there appear two mentions that I would like to treat here specifically, which are the Moorish guitar and the Latin guitar, which has been treated by different musicologists, especially when trying to write the history of the Spanish guitar. So here we have actually the longest consecutive series of stanzas dealing with musical instruments. It's not the only passage. There are several other passages with musical contents before and after that. But this is the largest part. And here is also where we have the guitarra morisca, the Moorish guitar, and the guitarra latina. So here in the second stanza, we have the guitarra morisca and the guitarra latina. I have put in red here the names of instruments, and in green, in Islamic green, the words that lead us to the world of Islam and of Arab culture in Al-Andalus. We have to take into consideration that during the time of this book was written, there still was an Islamic presence in the peninsula. We have the Kingdom of Granada, which fell only in 1492. And even in the Christian territories, there still was a presence of spoken Arab languages. So the later called Moriscos were only expelled way long after the conquest of Granada in the 16th century of some rebellions in the Alpujarras. And when we talk about Arab culture and Islamic culture in this epoch, it's not something belonging to the past, the long forgotten past, but it's something really present in this society at the moment. Actually, if we undertook the enterprise to analyze where these instrument names come from, then we would discover that even the majority of them actually came from Arab. So, for example, atambor is an Arab word. Laud, the lute, is an Arab word. Rabe is Arab, and so on. So the canon, medio canon comes from Hamoun, is also an Arab word. So we have quite a lot of Islamic influence, even in the terminology. This is the continuation of this list. And let's focus a moment on this stanza that we have here, where we where there appear the Moorish guitar and the Latin guitar. So the text says, en Spain, allí sale gritando la guitarra morisca de las voces agudas y de los puntos arisca, el corpudo laúd que tiene punto a la trisca, la guitarra latina con esos se aprisca. There comes the Moorish guitar with its high voices and harsh notes. The corpulent lutes are used for the trisca, which is a rustic dance. Yeah. The Latin guitar joins them. So this is more or less what the standard tells us. Okay, so let's see how musicologists usually approach this standard. So the basic question for them is, which organological reality hides behind the term guitarra morisca and guitarra latina? So which instrument is it? And it's quite funny to see that almost everyone who analyzes this stanza comes to different conclusions. And the instruments that are seen behind these terms are very heterogeneous. They're all tracked instruments, tracked string instruments. But there's absolutely no agreement on which exactly it is. So I could just put all of the classical references from Kozak's until in the 1930s, until Canone della Questa from 1983. So really, everyone sees something different behind these terms. So where are the problems? When we try to do research in medieval instruments in Spain, and of course in other countries too, we usually have two sets of sources. On one hand, we have literary sources, as for example, this Book of Good Love, and we have the ethnographic sources, for example, the Cantigas de Santa Maria that we will see later on. The problem is usually we do not have the link between the two. So when we read guitarra in this literature, we cannot infer to an organological reality because we have no visual source. And in our visual sources, for example, here, usually these are illuminations that do not have footnotes on explaining what are these instruments, and in many cases even there is no relation with the text, so the instruments do not appear in the accompanying texts. So we could say that establishing a link between the two groups of sources is, in the best case, highly hypothetical, in the worst case, pure fantasy. Okay, so let's look at a moment at these two instances. These are two illuminations from the Cantigas de Santa Maria of Alfonso the Wise, Castilian king, actually a little bit earlier than the period of the Book of Good Love, and also culturally quite different. Between the two, there's a big historical change which takes place from culture where Christian, Islamic, and Jewish culture more or less peacefully coexisted and even interchanged. The famous translation school of this king Alfonso the Wise, for example, in Toledo. And then when we move to the period of the outbreak of Ica, there was a change towards emphasizing Christianity and even starting to denigrate up to a certain point the Islamic and Moorish culture. And here, in both instances, and these two images actually are quoted in musicological literature when dealing with the Book of Good Love, we see two instruments which could be as well guitars. Now, the left image is not too convincing when dealing with Moorish guitar and Latin guitar, because of their clothing and so on. These two musicians are quite evidently Christians, both of them. In the right image, we have a representation of a Christian musician on the right, but we also have a Moorish musician to the left, identified by his clothing. So if we assume that these images represent Moorish and Latin guitar, the image to the right might as well be a candidate for this interpretation. Nonetheless, it is still problematic. We actually do not know this. Okay, then there are some further problems. One is that when musicologists deal with literature, as this book, for example, in most cases they deal with it as if the main intention of this 14th century author was to provide information for musicians and musicologists in the 20th century about musical instruments, which you might understand is not entirely the case. Neither the literary sources as this one, nor the iconographic as the Cantigas de Santa Maria can be interpreted this way. These images were not painted for this purpose, nor was the book written for this purpose. So we have to think about the intentions of the author. What did he want to tell us by using and quoting these instruments? This is actually something which happens quite a lot. I've given you another example here. Something that you can read in many histories of the guitar is that the poet from Ronda in the province of Malaga, Vicente Espinel, was the inventor of the 5-string guitar, because it is said, I think Lope de Vega said that he was the one who added the 5th string to the 4-chord guitar. If we look at the sources, then we see that almost a century before Vicente Espinel, there were also already 5-string guitars. So he was definitely not the inventor of this. What happens here is that this is a literary topos. It comes actually from ancient Greek culture, where Terpandros, one of the principal poets of ancient Greek literature, is said to have augmented the number of strings of the lira from 4 to 7. And this has developed into a cliche where we can say that someone who's very inventive, who's very creative, is someone who has added strings to a string instrument. But this is a metaphor, it's an allegory, it's not a real thing. The same happens with another very famous man in the history of perhaps instruments in Spain, Zeriar, a semi-legendary figure in Al-Andalus at the beginning, at the Caliphate of Córdoba, who is also said to have added a 5th string to the 4th string Arab blues, the oud. And again, this is a literary topos. So we do not have to, we cannot take this literally, but we have to understand that we are here in a region of literary conventions which use musical imagery. Okay, another problem is actually a bit more profound, which is a certain anachronistic view of language and conceptual thinking. Let me explain this. Usually, if you check out, for example, the entries in the New Groves Dictionary of Music and Musicians, and you look for the instruments, the image that is given is that there is like the perfect instruments, and everything which deviates from this is or primitive or a precursor or a degeneration or something like this. So if you take guitar, guitar is a 6-string instrument with a wasted body with 6 single strings, the Torres model that we all know, and everything which is different is like strange. There's a primitive guitar, it's an early guitar, it's a 5-chord guitar, and so on. We specify this because it's not the real one. That's not the real thing. And of course, this is very much Enlightenment thinking. So we can say that until the 18th century, people usually would not think this way. And if we have a look at the instruments that we have conserved from former times, that we see that guitar until the 18th century could range from an instrument like this to an instrument like this. And it could have 4, 5, 6, or even 7 strings. It could have double strings, single strings, it could have reentrant tunings, etc., etc. So it was not standardized. So we cannot talk about the guitar. We have to talk in plural about the guitars that existed. So this is one of the problems. Another problem has to do with the adjectives, especially the adjectives that refer to collectives. As we have here, for example, Moorish guitar or Latin guitar, these adjectives refer to collectives. Usually what musicologists think is that when we have something like a Moorish guitar, this guitar organologically is different from a Latin guitar. So, but this also does not work for this period. And brought you an example from the 16th century, from actually the first guitar treatise that we have in history by the physician Joan Grimalt, who published a work, the first work on the guitar, method, and a very popular method at that. So it's like a little bit like these, chord Bibles of Beatles songs that we can find today still in the music shops. And here he talks about guitarra castellana y catalana, so Castilian and Catalan guitar, which has brought some musicalists to the idea that Catalan guitar organologically is different from Castilian guitar. Even I found some treatises on the history, for example, of the cuatro in Venezuela, who say that the cuatro comes from the Catalan guitar. And I discovered this, wow, how is this possible? But if you look at the treatise, actually, it's the same instrument. The question is, if it's a Castilian guitar, then the text is in Castilian. And if it's Catalan guitar, the text is in Catalan. It's the only explanation. So no organological difference whatsoever here. Okay, so then if we take rather a literary approach to interpreting this passage, what could we ask? So for example, we could ask, what semantic context do the terms guitarra latina and guitarra morisca convey within the context of a text? And of course, as we have seen here, the guitar appears in the long list together with other instruments. And if we look at these instruments and if we imagine how this sounds, it's quite unlikely that this is a real orchestra. It does not represent an orchestra, but this conveys a meaning of music. So we have music here. Actually, the situation in the book is that all these musicians that show up in the passage receive Don Amor. So we could say master love, an allegorical figure which represents love. So we could say that the context is here that we have a festive context, a musical music that accompanies a festive context in order to receive Don Amor. Then we have to be very careful in interpreting Latina, and Morisca. Latina, of course, does not mean Latin guitar, referring to the Latin language, but it means Christian here. So this is quite easy to see. Morisca, I've translated it here as Moorish, but we have to be careful too, because the exact semantics of Moorish are very changing over history. So in the very beginning, there was no direct relationship with Islam, for example, but all the people that came from Northern Africa, being Islamic or not, were called Moorish because it comes from Mauros, from Greek, which means brown or dark. So they had darker skin, and so they were Moors in this sense. And only later on, it was applied to specifically to Islamic people. Actually, this continues until today. So sometimes we will, here in Spain, we will hear people talking about Los Moros, and they might refer as well to Moroccans, so Islamic people, as well as to Sub-Saharan Africans. So there's still something going on. The other thing is that in certain regions of Spain, Moorish is used for cultures that do not have anything to do neither with Islam nor with Africa or with dark-skinned people. For example, in Galicia, there is a type of Moros, so we have Castelos dos Moros, so the Moorish castles, which actually from the Stone Age. So here, the idea is not so much of darker people or Islamic people, but just the others. So we are we, and the others are Moros. So this is very important to take into consideration. Okay. Then what we see is probably or possibly what the author does here is to build up the binary opposition between Latina and Morisca, so a Christian and Moorish guitar. And if we take up this idea, then we will see that in all the book there are lots of binary oppositions. Actually, the book is built around these binary oppositions. So, for example, we have, as I told you before, good love and foolish love. So, buen amor and loco amor. And they are even personified as Don Amor, who represents good love, and the very lyrical subject, who represents loco amor. Then we have also another binary opposition between Carnival and Lent, personified as Don Carnal and Doña Cuaresma. And here, please take into consideration that Carnival and Don Carnal, they come from carnis, so from flesh. So the flesh is a very important element here. So if we take all this into consideration, then we come almost automatically to an interpretation of this text, which comes close to typological exegesis of the Old Testament. So we have the Old Testament humanity bound into the flesh, so carnal, which is correlated to the New Testament of the new humanity or the new covenant. This old humanity, this Old Testament, the Old Covenant, may be represented allegorically by different groups of peoples, by the Moors, for example, but also by rural characters, peasants, and so on. And especially these peasants also are very abundant in this book. And also references to the body and to the flesh in general also point into this direction. And here we might remember that alongside the Moorish and Christian lute, we have the corpuro lau, so the corpulent lute. And the lute is corpulent is not only a description of the body of the lute, but it's also a reference to the body in itself. And it's something which is explored in many other sources too. Read, for example, the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri, we have the very same image. So this is something of a commonplace in literature, in Christian literature. So we could infer from this also that Moorish not necessarily does refer to the Islam, but rather it represents the allegory of the Old Covenant. So the others, because we as good Christians are from the New Covenant and the others are the Old Covenant. So again, this identity alterity question. Okay, as I told you, in this passage, there's a reception made to Don Amor, so Master Love, and both humanities, both covenants actually receive him. So this is the idea that the Old Covenant and the New Covenant both receive love. They have both, they want to receive love, but in a different way. So here we have this characteristic carnivalesque ambiguity, which Michael Bakhtin talks so much about. So basically, we see here that we have to see this in this carnivalesque ambiguous manner. Okay, so let's come to the conclusions. We see that the description of the musical scenery does not reproduce necessarily any real model, but can be motivated only by the symbolic meaning of, in this case, the musical instruments. So, guitarra latina and guitarra morisca does not necessarily mean that we have two organological different items there behind, but it actually can be the very same instrument, but played by one group of people or one or the other. So there's not necessarily a difference of playing technique or music performed, but really this typological opposition. And Moorish does not necessarily make reference to real Muslimun, really Islamic people, but only to them as an allegory of the Old Covenant. And if we apply this, if we apply this perspective, then we actually can discover lots of intertextual relations with other texts, where also stringed instruments appear, like the Divine Comedy, as I told you before. And in this theological context, we have to take into consideration we're talking, in this case, about the Middle Ages. An epoch where really religious thinking was like penetrating almost all spheres of society, and is reflected very deeply also in every kind of literature. And if we apply this, then we actually can discover some discourses that reach out unto the pre-Christian texts, for example, in ancient Greek literature, and we can identify meanings that even last until the Spanish Baroque, for example, in the works of Calderón de la Barca. So these meanings are present in all these centuries, And it's within the process of secularization in the 18th and especially the 19th century that these meanings somehow fall into oblivion. And this is why it seems so strange to us. So we do not necessarily think about the guitar in these terms. But if we interpret properly these sources, then actually we can understand a way a lot better the meaning and the presence of an instrument like the guitar in this period. So thank you very much for your attention.